Let's talk about the Nakba. The Nakba is one of the most important things for us to really understand because it lays at the very heart of why so many people are pro-Hamas and pro-Palestinian, why there are accusations of apartheid and ethnic cleansing, and what is fueling so much of the ire and the anger toward Israel. It's also at the heart of what has created this anti-Zionist narrative, and it is the very heart of what has created the story of the Palestinian people and of their victimhood. It has enraged them into this psychotic delusion of justifying terrorism. I've included a bibliography at the end of this report. It's important for you to know that this is a well-sourced report, that this isn't just coming from my own personal narrative. The problem with the Nakba is that while many of the details of what happened are true, the story behind it is absolutely a lie.
The short clip you have just seen is from a 5-minute 50-second video by an American Jewess named Sarah Werrin. It professes to debunk the Palestinian victim narrative of the Nakba, the Great Expulsion. While she does make a good point or two, as the great Thomas Sowell would say, she has started the story in the middle, replacing it with the world's oldest victim narrative, the one I call the legend of Kosher Red Riding Hood and the big bad anti-Semitic wolf. She says she has included a bibliography at the end of the video. Not on YouTube where I found it, but we can dispense with that, because in this lengthy rebuttal I will provide you with actual sources. She starts the story in 1948 with the British partition plan. That actually dates to 1947, but we will forgive her that. The reality is that Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire until it was broken up after the First World War. The Great War as it was then known. The Caliphate was finally abolished on March 3, 1924, not by the Western powers, but by the Turks. Until the late 19th century, its population was overwhelmingly Arab. The year 1881 saw the beginning of the first Aliyah, waves of Jewish emigrants settling in the country, but it was still relatively small. In 1896, Theodor Herzl published Der Judenstaat, in which he argued that Jews should have their own homeland. This slim book can be considered the founding document of modern Zionism. At the time and for many years he was regarded as a crank by Jewish establishments worldwide. Herzl died young, and 3 months later the journalist Lucien Wolf denounced the concept in an article called The Zionist Peril, published by the Jewish Quarterly Review of October 1904. Wolf argued that European Jews were a religious community of white men not essentially different from the European Roman Catholics and Protestants. Okay, 120 years on we would call them a religious community of white men, women and non-binary persons, but that is essentially the same. Although other Jews emigrated to Palestine, it was principally European, i.e. white Jews who made up the first Aliyah, Russian Jews who made up the second Aliyah between 1904 and 1914, while the third Aliyah between 1919 and 1923 was made up largely of Eastern European and Russian Jews. The fifth Aliyah was between 1929 and 1939. As might be suspected, this was spurred primarily by the Nazi persecution. It remains to be seen how many of those Jews wanted to emigrate to Palestine. Most would have preferred the Promised Land, the United States, but the Zionist movement had other ideas, and by this time it was not only well funded, but was supported by powerful politicians known as Gentile Zionists. We can argue about how much the Balfour Declaration of 1917 was responsible for the subsequent turmoil in the Middle East, but whenever a large body of immigrants moves into a country of dissimilar stock, racially, culturally, with different customs, there is sure to be friction. Today this is called racism, and it is the white natives who are blamed for all such a friction. As the Jews who moved to Palestine and who now inhabit Israel are overwhelmingly white, it stands to reason that they will be blamed for everything, especially by the extreme left. So let's hear no more talk about left-wing anti-Semitism. Islamist anti-Semitism is something very different and very real. We will discuss that shortly. Sarah Werrin glosses over how the conflict between the Arabs and the Zionists escalated, in particular the terror campaign against both the Arabs and the British by the Zionists. In fact, she doesn't mention that at all. The National Archives at Kew holds a series of documents relating to Jewish illegal organisations in Palestine. Here is one of them. You can download this particular document for free from their website. The ferocity of the Zionist campaign is no big secret, but like the later grooming gang scandal, it's something decent people are not permitted to talk about. There have even been books written on the subject, like this one by a Jew who has joint British-Israeli citizenship. The most ruthless of the Zionist terrorists were the Irgun and Leahy. The latter is an acronym. Leahy was also known as the Stern Gang, founded by Avraham Stern, a Polish Jew who was killed by the British in February 1942. But his evil lived on. The atrocities of the Irgun included 15 adults, 3 children killed with 24 injured by a bomb thrown into a market at Haifa on June 19, 1938, and 20 Arabs killed by another explosion in Haifa on June 19, 1939. There were also numerous shootings. On August 26, 1939, 2 British police officers were killed by a bomb in Jerusalem. 6 days after that, Hitler invaded Poland, and 2 days later, after he had ignored an ultimatum from Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, Britain declared war on Germany. The Second World War was the bloodiest war in human history, and although it is fashionable nowadays to blame it on Hitler and Hitler alone, things are seldom that simple. Hitler never wanted war with Britain, and atrocities were committed on both sides. While World War II was still raging, however, the Zionists started their own war within a war. On September 27, 1944, they attacked 4 British police stations, and 2 days later they assassinated a British detective in Jerusalem. This was while the Allies were fighting to save Jews from the gas chambers, be it noted. Gas chambers indeed. The end of the Second World War did not bring about the end of Zionist terror. Their most outrageous atrocity was the bombing of the King David Hotel. This is how they remember it in a commemorative plaque. The hotel housed the British Mandate Secretariat as well as the Army headquarters. On July 22, 1946, Irgun fighters, at the order of the Hebrew resistance movement, planted explosives in the basement. Warning phone calls has been made to the hotel's dispatch, the Palestine Post and the French consulate, urging the hotel's occupants to leave immediately. The hotel was not evacuated, and after 25 minutes the bombs exploded. The entire western wing was destroyed, and to the Irgun's regret, 92 persons were killed. And here is Kosher Red Riding Hood blaming the big bad anti-Semitic wolf for the massacre. Irgun leader Menachem Begin stressed his desire to avoid civilian casualties and said 3 telephone calls were placed, 1 to the hotel, another to the French consulate and a 3rd to the Palestine Post, warning that explosives in the King David Hotel would soon be detonated. On July 22, 1946, the calls were made. Adina Hai Nissan said she called the hotel switchboard 30 minutes before the explosion. That call was apparently received and ignored. Begin quotes one British official who supposedly refused to evacuate the building, saying, "We don't take orders from the Jews." The Irgun also detonated a bomb nearby, which broke windows but did not cause any injuries and may have been intended to cause panic and encourage evacuation of the building. As a result, when the bombs exploded, the casualty toll was high, a total of 91 killed and 45 injured. Among the casualties were 15 Jews. Menachem Begin was a monster, yet he went on to become Prime Minister of Israel. The Zionist terror campaign caused a great deal of animosity in Britain, and as ever, Kosher Red Riding Hood played the victim. On August 6, 1947, the editor of a newspaper in the north of England published a strongly worded article condemning, among other things, the murder of a young soldier in Palestine. James Court was dragged into court by those poor, persecuted, powerless people on a charge of seditious libel. A jury of his peers took only minutes to acquit him. The outrages and atrocities committed by the Zionists against the British give the lie to the ludicrous claims by the extreme left that Israel is some kind of Western imperialist project. Now let us return to the fantasy world of Sarah Werrin. She says after the British partition plan created Israel, it was attacked by 5 Arab nations. The reality is that the Zionists were incredibly well armed while the Arabs were not. The biggest myth is that there was an Israeli war of independence. There was no such war. What there was a series of massacres of helpless Arabs, the most notorious of which was Dar Yassin on April the 9th, 1948, when no fewer than 4 Zionist terror groups murdered over 100 people. 4 days later, the Arabs exacted a terrible revenge when they attacked a Jewish medical convoy and killed 78 Jews. As ever, it is the innocent who suffer, but in spite of this, the Arabs got the message, and the majority of Palestinians fled their homes. Even so, an estimated 15,000 were killed. Werrin says that during the Second World War, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem met with Hitler, and they hatched a plan to exterminate the Jews of Palestine. The Mufti even wanted to build gas chambers. Gas chambers indeed. Ludicrous though this claim was, it totally undermines a claim frequently made by so-called anti-racists, that if they ever came to power in Britain, Hitler's spiritual heirs would exterminate not only Jews, but blacks, Arabs, the owner of the Thai nail bar on your high street, the staff of your local Chinese restaurant, and Mr. Patel in his corner shop. The reality is that the Nazis were no more racist than other Europeans, and a lot less so than most white Americans. This has nothing to do with hate. It is simply human nature. As the Iraqis say, I and my brother against my cousin, I and my cousin against our neighbour, I and my neighbour against the world. Human nature also includes cruelty beyond belief, and that is what the Palestinians experienced, what they continue to experience. It took a while for the Palestinian resistance to get organised, but throughout the 1950s the boot was on the other foot, at least as far as terror was concerned, and again it was the innocent who suffered. It began with the murder of a teenage girl in Jerusalem on New Year's Day 1952. The worst such incident of that decade happened March 16-17, 1954, when terrorists boarded a late-night bus travelling between Eilat and Tel Aviv, murdering the driver and 11 of its 15 passengers. Who travels on buses apart from ordinary people? There were fewer such attacks in the 1960s, but 1972 saw one of the worst ever when Palestinian terrorists attacked an Olympic team, in Germany of all places, West Germany as it then was. The Munich massacre left a total of 17 people dead, 5 Israeli athletes, 6 Israeli coaches, a German police officer, and 5 of the 8 terrorists. In 1967, the Zionists consolidated their stranglehold, taking total control of both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. These maps show how Palestine has been progressively eroded. Zionist apologists and their dupes have the temerity to claim Palestine never actually existed, that the Zionists have returned to their ancestral homelands. The reality is that Theodor Herzl was born in Hungary. The first Prime Minister of Israel was born in Poland. The first Prime Minister of Israel to be born there was its 5th, Yitzhak Rabin. He was born in Jerusalem, which at the time was in Palestine. The Palestine we are told never existed, but even his parents were refugees from Eastern Europe. The Zionists are overwhelmingly European Jews, i.e. white. They originate from Eastern Europe, Western Europe, including England, while others, like the propagandist Caroline Glick, were born in the United States. The Palestinians continued to resist, including during the 2 intifadas, which led to some shocking scenes, arguably none more shocking than that of the 2 Palestinians having their arms broken with rocks by IDF soldiers. For decades, especially after the end of the Second World War, powerful Jewish organisations the world over, Jewish leftists and Jewish mischief makers, often aided by their Goy fellow travellers, have smeared all and sundry as anti-Semites, including at times members of their own tribe. Everyone was branded anti-Semitic from William Shakespeare to J.K. Rowling. Everyone and everything. They also used what Herzl called their terrible power of the purse to censor their enemies, real and imagined. The ADL and the Southern Poverty Law Centre have been two of the main players in this unsavoury game. These facts cannot be disputed by reasonable people. Indeed, if you speak to the real Jews, the Torah Carta, or read books by accredited Jewish authors, they say exactly the same things as the craziest of anti-Semites, albeit in more moderate language. Here are a few examples. We begin with a Torah true Jew explaining the root cause of the current malaise. In this video he refers to Al-Quds. This is the Arabic name for Jerusalem.
I'm a witness. I know the Arabs are very good, no problem till the Zionist movement starts. My grandmother told me before the Zionist movement starts, they babysitting each other, the kids. They borrow from both each other like brothers, like brothers. The idea of Zionism to take away the land from the Palestinians, from the Arabs, is starting the whole fighting. Not Arabs the problem, not Jews the problem, not Judaism, not Muslim, only Zionism.
Here are a few images that speak louder than words about the reality of Jewish power, always accompanied by whining and wailing about how everybody has it in for them for no good reason. But then, as in the original biblical story, when Kosher Red Riding Hood had cried wolf once too often, there really was a big bad anti-Semitic wolf. Apart from the conspirators themselves, the entire world was taken by surprise on the morning of October 7, 2023. But for Jews, especially those in the diaspora, the real horror was not these outrageous massacres. It was the response of the extreme left. The people they always thought were their useful idiots, even their friends. Contrary to the professional gaslighter Jen Psaki, it wasn't the mythical worldwide white supremacist conspiracy that was out in the streets chanting "from the river to the sea." It wasn't Nazis who came out in support of the murderers on campus. It wasn't right-wing bigots who tore down posters of the hostages, who claimed calling for the genocide of Jews did not necessarily constitute harassment.
I will ask you one more time. Does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Harvard's rules of bullying and harassment? Yes or no?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric.
And is it anti-Semitic rhetoric?
Anti-Semitic rhetoric when it crosses into conduct that amounts to bullying, harassment, intimidation, that is actionable conduct, and we do take action.
So the answer is yes, that calling for the genocide of Jews violates Harvard Code of Conduct, correct?
Again, it depends on the context.
It does not depend on the context. The answer is yes, and this is why you should resign. These are unacceptable answers across the board.
These people came out in force because they knew what would be the reaction. The only possible reaction to such a calculated act of mass murder, and because they had seen it before during the two intifadas, and with the outrageous flotilla massacre in which Israel murdered 9 innocent men and recorded a song that mocked the victims. This time, though, there were a few surprises. Here is Chris Hedges, a dumb goy who believes in white privilege, because like the idiot feminist who came up with this absurd concept, he was born into privilege and thought it was due to his white skin.
Ehud Barak, Israel's defense minister, said Israel is engaged in a war to the bitter end against Hamas in Gaza. A war? Israel uses sophisticated attack jets and naval vessels to bomb densely crowded refugee camps, schools, apartment blocks, mosques, and slums, to attack a population that has no air force, no air defense, no navy, no heavy weapons, no artillery units, no mechanized armor, no command and control, no army, and calls it a war.
Following the October 7th massacre, people the world over realised that Kosher Red Riding Hood wasn't the only one who had been deceiving the world. People the world over who could be bothered to listen and to watch as the IDF uncovered a tunnel network of breathtaking length and complexity. The fact that there were tunnels was no big secret. One might have been forgiven for believing there to be only a couple of these a few hundred yards long to bring goods in from Egypt. Instead, the IDF uncovered a complex longer than the tunnels of the London Underground, and their purpose was purely military, in particular to facilitate the invasion and ultimately the destruction of Israel. Most people who hadn't studied the Middle East also believed Gaza and the West Bank were still under occupation. The truth is that Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, and what followed was a veritable civil war between Hamas and Fatah, the latter of which had been led by Yasser Arafat until his death in November 2004 at the age of 75. Before going any further, a few words about October 7th are in order. As is often the case with atrocities and even natural disasters, the fog of war can lead to false claims. There were false claims made about October 7th on both sides. Specifically, on the Israeli side there were claims of 40 beheaded babies and the mass rapes of women. The former turned out to be false. We could argue about the scale of the rapes, but clearly one was one too many. There was, though, no denying the mass murder of innocent civilians, including this kibbutz family, or the kidnapping of the hostages. These people were peaceniks, as were many of the others killed. Up until October 7th, many people referred to Gaza as an open-air concentration camp. Now it looks more like a bomb site, but whose fault is that? Remember what Chris Hedges said about it having no army? He was wrong. We were all wrong, because Kosher Red Riding Hood isn't the only one who has a huge propaganda machine. Let's take a look at some of the lies and distortions pushed by Hamas and its supporters. This woman is Israa Riyad Jabez. The burn scars on her face and hands resulted from a failed terrorist attack. She was a suicide bomber and was sentenced to a mere 11 years. And would you believe she had the audacity to ask for plastic surgery? She was released in 2023. This is Nafuz Jad Hamad. In December 2021, when she was 14 years old, she stabbed this young mother with a 30cm knife. The victim was said to have not been seriously injured, but obviously she would have been affected psychologically. Hamas had a large army and countless civilians who were prepared to go along with it. Over the past 2 decades, the Palestinians have received massive aid from many sources. As some pundits have pointed out, with all that aid they could have turned it into another Monte Carlo. Instead they dug tunnels, and this is the result. Nafuz Hamad received a 12-year sentence for attempted murder, but was set to be released in November 2023. This Palestinian news site makes no mention of her crime, in this article at least. Why would a 14-year-old girl stab a young mother in front of her kids? Because she was brainwashed, that's why. Here is a small sample, but there's a lot more where that came from. The first clip is from a long compilation video by a couple of Islam-hating clowns. The second is from a video by Palestine Media Watch. Something else you might like to ask yourself is, how many concentration camps have TV stations?
And we care about their reaction to our programs. So we have live shows to make sure that the message is relayed the way we intended.
Perhaps the most famous scene from the children's show, a Mickey Mouse look-alike being beaten to death by an Israeli. It could be a case of television imitating life. After all, death and violence lurk around every corner in Gaza. But there are concerns both inside and outside Palestine about the long-term effects this will have on young minds.
You think? You think?
يا بني لم نخلق للسعادة فأنت في نظري مشروع للشهادة وسلاحنا إسلامنا وذخيرتنا أبناؤنا فأنت يا بني مشروع للشهادة
ودرب الشهادة لنا الخيار
باسم الحرية ضحي بالأرواح
وأننا سنقدم دماءنا وأبناءنا وأسرنا فداء لله ثم الوطن.
بتلاقي احنا عندنا المرأة الفلسطينية ليست كأي مرأة في العالم، شافت ابنها رخيص على الوطن، ما عادت إلا أن تزغرد للشهيد وتفتخر بالشهادة وأيضا تنشد للعريس.
فنقاتل حتى ينفذ أي طفل فلسطيني في بيته حتى يموت.
قال لي امي واذا استشهدت ما تعيطي ولا تزعلي، وانا الحمد لله رب العالمين محتسبته عند رب العالمين، محتسبته لله وشهيد الحمد لله، شهيد الحمد لله.
فخر إنه تفضل إشي يعني وأنا مندهش ومسرور كل السرور إنه ابني استشهد واليوم بزف وأنا الحمد لله زفت وبنبي محسن هالشعور وهالانبساط عند الأنبياء والشهداء.
When this photograph was first published, he drew a mixture of humour and outrage, even comparison with the Warsaw Ghetto. I must admit I was taken in by this too, but in view of what you've just heard, is it so implausible that even a child of this age might have been booby-trapped? What is truly amazing is that the white liberals and so-called radicals who support this sort of thing claim Trump supporters belong to a cult, and that when their own nations are invaded, as they are being invaded now, they side with the invaders, even those convicted of unspeakable crimes. And one more thing, did you know Hamas even uses crisis actors?
أمريكا بتتفرج وأمريكا بتدعم إسرائيل ومش عارفين إيش بدنا نسوي. الدول العربية بهدلتنا وأمريكا بهدلتنا، يعني مش قادرة أمريكا تحمي إسرائيل توقف في عند حدها، بتوقف في عند حدها.
هذا هو حال ولسان جميع المواطنين في شمال قطاع غزة. المعاناة تتسع وتتفاقم مع قصف مستمر أيضا وخيام قد سقطت على رؤوس المواطنين في هذه الليلة. حسام شبات لصالح قناة الجزيرة مباشر شمالي قطاع غزة.
Yeah, that happens. Her mood suddenly changed, let's just say. Now, for those who are familiar with how media works and how these sort of things work, you know exactly what happened there. And they forgot the camera was still rolling. But let's go back to Mr. Fafo. In case you're not familiar, Mr. Fafo is Mr. F Around and Find Out, who's become quite famous or infamous since October. He's had many roles in Gaza over the last few months. We're going to go through all the different roles he's had, by the way, but this is the latest update we have from Mr. Fafo. Just before this video, he was claiming that there is literally no food left. There's no food for the civilians, for himself, they're all starving. Somehow, he made a mistake by making this video, giving excess food to cats.
طلع كديك كمية البسس هدول صار لهم فترة كبيرة مش فاكرين ايش لهم كلهم بدي يجيك كمل الريف
By the way, this is all part of the humanitarian aid package, by the way. All the cans that they have, the tuna cans and everything else. Apparently there's not enough for civilians, but there's enough for cats. And by the way, I'm saying it as a cat person, and I feel sorry for all these stray cats that have been left alone in Gaza. There's so many cats, by the way, in that neighborhood as well. But the situation continues to escalate. Now, as I promised you, let's do a quick summary of Mr. F around and find out, Mr. Fafo, over the last few months, what sort of roles he's had so far. Well, he initially started as a freedom fighter, as on the left, top left. He was actually celebrating on the 7th of October. Then he didn't have a good time. He became a blood donor. That was actually very good of him. Thank you very much, Mr. Fafo. Then he actually became a foster father for about half a day, top right. And then he became a resilient patient. Then he died. In the middle, he actually became a corpse. Then he became a revived corpse. He actually had his iPhone on as well, which is quite, powerful. Then he became a war correspondent, although on his helmet, it doesn't really say press, but not really sure what happened there. Then he started singing around. He started making videos, American Idol, walking around Gaza, singing. And then he became a healthcare worker, a radiology technician, and he also promoted that. Then he became a tour guide, showed us around Gaza again, and then he died again a couple of times, but he came back to life. And he's still alive and kicking. He's having a great time right now. I mean, the influencers are everywhere. Grifters are everywhere. Team Grifters, by the way. All proud of all your work, whether you are in London or Gaza. Work hard. You have to survive and look after those cats. Don't forget about that. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Maya TC, and we are the media.
What did Hamas want, and what does it still want? Here they are in their own words.
السابع من أكتوبر يجب أن نمسك به ونبني عليه ونراكم عليه.
النصية لازم نأدبها وحنأدبها مرة ثانية وثالثة، ومش هذا حتكون طوفان الأقصى أول مرة، لا حتكون ثانية وثالثة ورابعة.
الإسرائيلي معروف عنه أنه بحب الحياة. إحنا نضحي نعتبر أنه قتلنا شهداء.
المقاومة مجهزة ومعززة بحاضنة شعبية.
عاصمة لفلسطين فقط كدولة مستقلة، وإنما ستكون عاصمة للخلافة الإسلامية.
إسرائيل دولة لا مقام لها على أرضنا، إحنا الدولة لابد أن نزيلها.
Ordinarily, AIPAC is not to be trusted, but even a broken clock is right twice a day. So what does Hamas want? These people are Islamist fanatics. Their aim is to kill every Jew in Israel, and every Jew in the world, and every apostate. Remember what they did to this guy, whose only crime was to write a bad novel? Look at what they've done to their own kids. First it will be the Israelis and the Jews. Then they will kill every atheist, every Christian, every homosexual, starting with these degenerates, and everyone who refuses to bow down to their perverted version of Islam. We've already seen them, experienced them here. The 9/11 attacks was the really big one, but there have been many others. The Bali bombing, 7/7, the Brussels bombings. These people are not ordinary terrorists. They are insane. So where do we go from here? The Israelis have declared they will not stop until they have destroyed all the Hamas tunnels in Gaza, and Hamas with them. As they have set about this task, most of the rest of the world has looked on in horror. But what is the alternative? If civilian dwellings and public buildings, including hospitals, are used as human shields to store weapons and launch rocket attacks, they become valid military targets, whether or not there are tunnels underneath them, whether or not innocent women, children and even babies die by the thousand. That is a terrible thing for anyone to say, but again, what is the alternative? Every one of those deaths of those killed so far and those who will be killed before this madness is ended. Every single death must be laid at the door of Hamas, not of Israel. You can argue that Zionism caused all these problems in the Middle East, and some still do, but we're long past that now. The terrorists who murdered Arabs, Britons and even Jews to bring about their state are long dead. There may be a handful left, men in their 90s and beyond, but the campaign is over. The Zionists won, and we all have to live with it. To insist otherwise after all this time is nearly as absurd as those who claim Americans are inhabiting stolen land and should give it back to the red man. Israel exists, but it is no Jewish state, however much its leaders may proclaim it one. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, and especially in the past few years, countless immigrants to Israel have tenuous, at times entirely imaginary claims to Jewishness. Anyone can call himself a Jew, and anyone can be called one. I've been called one often enough. So is this guy. The Islamists hate the Zionists because they believe them to be Jews. Brainwashed white leftists hate them because they are white. Where leftists are concerned, anti-Semitism has nothing to do with it. There is no greater proof of this than the way Iran's charismatic president was treated when he visited the United States to speak at Columbia University. He was treated like dirt, traduced and insulted. There were loud protests against him. Ahmadinejad offered the West the hand of friendship. Remember that absurd incident with the Marines? Look where we are now. And look at the protests. The same types of people, indeed some of the very same people who protested against Ahmadinejad, branding him an anti-Semite, are now siding with real anti-Semites to wipe Israel off the map. Literally, not metaphorically as he suggested in his speech on the Zionist regime. Last year, while campaigning in Australia, this woman was smeared as a Nazi and was nearly stamped to death in New Zealand by a mob of deranged leftists because she opposed this: the surgical mutilation of vulnerable young women, and at times even underage girls, by the lunatics of the trans movement. One other thing, and this is important. I don't want to sound like I'm engaging in victim blaming, but who started all this insanity about race? It wasn't the Nazis. It wasn't even the Ku Klux Klan. It was Jews. At one time, every intelligent person realised race was real, and that people of different races could live side by side amicably. Side by side, not what we have today. But even before the Nazi persecution, the very concept of race was attacked. Again, principally by Jews. This Jew, Franz Boas, did incalculable damage. As long ago as 1910, he wrote that the only way to solve the Negro problem in the United States was by promoting racial amalgamation. That's right, miscegenation. What Negro problem was that precisely? When has there ever really been a Negro problem in the United States? Another Jew had similar ideas. Magnus Hirschfeld may not have been the very first person to use the word racism, but he was the first to popularise it. In his last major work called simply Racism, which was published posthumously in 1935, he wrote, "Mankind, a unity to begin with, and destined to become a unity once more." This is the Marxist position today, although they seldom spell it out in such plain language, and some Jews go even further, like Noel Ignatieff, who called openly to abolish the white race.
My concern is doing away with whiteness. Whiteness is a form of racial oppression, sure. The suggestion is that it is somehow possible to separate whiteness from oppression, and it is not. There can be no white race.
Does this mean all Jews are in on this vile plot? Of course not. Some have fought against it and still do. Jews like Laura Loomer, and especially Chaya Raichik, who has done much to expose the aforementioned trans movement. There is Stephen Miller, who served in the Trump administration. There are others, but the dominant Jews are and always have been leftists, most notably the ADL and the misnamed Southern Poverty Law Centre. In the UK, a particularly odious cabal of Jews founded the Searchlight organisation. What do these Jews want? In short, the total destruction of Western man and his democratic institutions, which is the reason, the only reason, they support mass non-white immigration into the West. The Islamists seek to destroy Western man too. So Jews have a choice to make. The extreme left have already made theirs. These are the people who claim to be your friends, even your protectors against the mythical international Nazi conspiracy, remember? And this is how they treat you now.
Alone! They want our people dead! They want us killed!
And so part of it,
How is it allowed? How are you allowing this? Why are you putting us so? They want us dead!
Jews need to decide who to side with, but if they choose the side of Western man, they had better do so soon.